It's a point of entry that gives a foundation for a company to really grow exponentially when you have development of the company, including compliance.
But your end goal is IPO, maybe, get acquired, maybe, or at least get investor dollars, right? And if you're going to do any of those things, if you're not doing the proper compliance, those deals are going to fall through.
Hey, Warriors, welcome back to Mission Critical Aerospace and Defense Recruiting. I'm your host, Katherine Gerald. Today, we are diving into a topic that may get a few groans, but it is absolutely essential for any company aiming to scale or exit successfully. And I promise we are going to make it hot again. Compliance and legal readiness. I am joined by two experts from Taft Law. John Gordon, a top deal lawyer specializing in gov contracts and aerospace, and Shawn Cheadle, former general counsel at Lockheed Space and a veteran with extensive experience guiding major defense contractors through the complexities of compliance and commercial law. We'll talk about cyber hygiene, explore how companies can build strong foundations from the very beginning, how legal and compliance strategies can actually accelerate growth rather than slow you down, and why being due diligence ready should be part of every exec's mindset, not just a last minute scramble. Let's dive in. Welcome, John. Welcome, Shawn.
Right, Dan.
Thanks. Good to be here. Thanks for having us.
So, getting into it, you have worked with both big companies and VC-backed startups. What is the number one tip you would give to an exec as they are starting their company that can avoid a ton of pain in the long run?
Yeah. So, wouldn't be a lawyer podcast if we didn't give lawyer talk, right? But anything we say, obviously, is not legal advice. You should always consult your own counsel on anything Shawn and I talk about. And any views we express, obviously, they're mine or Shawn's. They're not necessarily Taft's. I do a lot more of the VC startup end, and Shawn does a lot more of the more mature company compliance end with his experience at Lockheed. So I think I'll say from the young company side, really two buckets that you wanna really focus on. It's the finances and the compliance, right? So the first end, when we do these venture deals or an M&A, if you get that far, is that your cap table is something that can really get to be a mess really fast and really early, especially when you start handing out equity to employees and things like that. So keeping that squared away is very important. But also the next end that gets put to the side more is your compliance, especially if you're relying on government contract revenue. And that's kind of where we like to have Shawn come in with his experience. But that's just something that gets pushed a lot or is at least reactive instead of proactive. So I'll let Shawn kind of speak to what he likes to see in young companies from the compliance end that are especially those that are relying on like government contracts.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks, Katherine. My experience is when you have a mature company, and now this still may be a small company, right? If you use the SBA standard of small company, that's still 500 employees and 7.5 million in revenues.
That's not tiny.
Not tiny, but you could be a $20 million company and who knows, 4 years old. But one of the things they have a challenge with is compliance areas. And there's a host of compliance areas where we see people really mess up. I would like to say at the outset, if you're a founder, that you're not just developing product, you're developing a company. See a lot of, I need to move product, get money, product money.
It's like, I've got an awesome idea. Let's take it to market.
Right. Let's go to market with software, product, service, whatever. And they forget about this cloud of compliance. And if you start from ground up, to John's point, with the right financing and the right structure, why forget about compliance? And you don't have to do 100 different compliance policies, right? So there's, the dirty dozen is what I like to say. We can get into that here in a little bit if you like, but it's a point of entry that I think gives a foundation for a company to really grow exponentially when you have development of the company, including compliance.
But it's not revenue generating. How do you keep it from, not being just another line item and an expense? And how do you put controls on that?
Well, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I guess I'll say just from the venturing, because I do want to, I try to be the empathetic one to founders, right? Because I always say, like, we're just giving them, another important hat to wear, but they've got 15 hats to wear, right?
Right. I got to make payroll. That's my bigger problem.
Exactly. So, try to be empathetic there. But what I always say is that, look, okay, like, fair, but your end goal is one of two things, one of I guess a few things. IPO, maybe, get acquired, maybe, or at least get investor dollars, right? And if you're going to do any of those things, you got to go through a ton of due diligence. So if you're not doing the proper compliance, those deals are going to fall through, and then all that money you're making and all that revenue you're generating is not going to be worth it. It's not going to be
Don't
worth
hire
anything.
your sister-in-law to run your books.
So, yeah. So it's, you got to have that mindset that, like, okay, it may not come up today, but if this company's going to accomplish what I want it to, then all my work's going to be for nothing if I don't do that end correctly. Go ahead, Shawn.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the concern that it's a cost and not a revenue driver. I would argue that it is a revenue driver because you're going to attract more customers that want your business when you're a compliant company. When your shop looks pristine and it's in order, we like to think as customers, and this is Lockheed Martin looking at small suppliers, right? They're going to do a walkthrough. They're going to do a vendor survey. And part of that survey is going to include your ability to comply with terms and conditions, with FAR and DFARS flow downs, regulatory flow downs. And you may want that contract, but you're not going to have an ability to comply with it if you haven't established this company in that vein. So, and we're not talking these high level quality assurance certifications, but you can get those too, like AS9100. But it's more than that, right? How do you treat your employees? You need a solid employee plan. You need strong financial plan policies, right? That I think allows the company then to attract larger customers that are really going to be revenue driving customers. And that's where compliance to me turns into a cost growth driver and not an expense.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as a search firm owner, I get the call of, we just won $140 million NASA contract. And oh God, I don't know what our compliance looks like. Can't we find somebody to fix this tomorrow? So I guess kind of in that vein, we hear a lot about the word compliance. Let's face it, it sounds kind of boring and abstract. But what's one real world compliance miss you've seen that cost a company big time?
Well, to me, it starts with employee management. You build trust internally within a company, not just externally to your customers. And you're going to have a stronger workforce when you have a strong employee, first a code of business conduct and ethics, managers treating people right, directors treating people right, C-suite treating people right, all the way to the board. And that includes obviously the interaction between employees and what you can and can't do at law. Most state laws will govern these things, but also how are you handling their data? Are you building trust that we have strong cyber hygiene from the start, that we're going to protect employee privacy data, or privacy period, right? There's privacy areas within a company. Are we offering that level of privacy? When you building that trust, that's your foundation. And those people are going to be more productive, and that's going to drive revenue. And they're going to stay longer and be more loyal and probably attract better talent for the company as it scales. So why not put some horsepower into strong employment policies? Because I've seen it go the other way, where suddenly people are leaving, maybe a super talented person that you just trained up, and now you're getting bad reviews out in the marketplace, and it's no wonder you can't get contracts, right? So start internally first, build trust, and that trust is going to grow. Now you have employees who are going to treat their customers like you want them to be treated.
Mm-hmm. You said cyber hygiene. Tell me more.
Well, it's everywhere today. Even though there's not a federal cybersecurity law or a federal privacy act, most states have some form of cyber, and they embedded in their privacy acts. 15 states have independent cyber clauses, but regulations also govern. If you're in finance, banking of any sort, right? If you're in defense, that's aerospace defense, any kind of government contract, you're going to have to meet a cyber threshold. And that means, you have to have IT folks who are not just Windows administrators. You need somebody with cyber background who knows how to protect your systems. Think about encrypted devices as soon as you can, because people lose laptops, people lose cell phones. Do you offer company cell phones at any phase, in an early startup? Or are you allowing employees to use their own phone? If they are, do you have an encrypted software program on that phone for them to connect to your network? Otherwise, you're creating a risk. And, even small companies can scale this, right? It does not have to be super unaffordable. Sometimes it can seem that way, especially when you get that big contract you just mentioned, and now you're trying to backpedal and clean stuff up. It's better to build and scale.
I am amazed at how many CEO and founders I talk to when you ask them what's keeping you up at night. You expect, supply chain, talent issues. A lot of them are saying now, and this has changed over the past 3 years, getting hacked. And we're seeing that, in the small and mid-sized company, that fear is really there because, that's an easy entree for a lot of people with government contracting interests. When it comes to fundraising and getting acquired, so this one's probably for John. What's the one thing most leaders don't usually realize until it's too late?
Until it's too late, there's most things can be fixed, I would say. Most things just cost you a little more
The
on
most
that line item.
expensive whoops.
I think one of the issues that comes up a lot that I think that founders don't even realize like they're supposed to be doing is certain intellectual property protections. And really namely like IP assignment agreements, right? So when you have a company, you got 3 or 4 people, whatever, and they're all working on something. Even if you have someone who didn't do any work on whatever the product is you're making, when an investor comes in or especially in an acquisition, they want to know that if I buy this company or if I invest in this company, I'm going to own the IP because that's what's valuable to me, right? And what they don't want is to enter into a company that is just about to get sued by some ex-employee who's going to claim that actually I made that in my garage and I brought a bunch of stuff with me and yeah. And that happened. Like a lot of times we'll have to get with these founders and you have to chase down this person and they'll say, well, they quit, 3 years ago. And I'm sorry, like if you want this money, like we have to find this person. So that happens.
Pray they're in good health.
And they're not, so they don't have to be like complicated agreements, but just know that, I think this is especially true in hardware companies, but like your IP is very, very important to investors and acquirers. Yeah. So you can do some early things like IP assignment, either agreements or clauses in employment agreements, but a lot of things up front that sort of protect things and make investors and buyers feel good about coming into your company.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so changing gears slightly from IP and ownership. CEOs and founders have a lot to sign on a daily basis. And I know robust companies have contract managers and directors and general counsel, but smaller firms don't. What's the one contract term you wish every founder actually understood before they signed?
Well, today I do serve on our commercial transactions team here at Taft. So we service like Fortune 50, clients all the way down to like single founder startups. And these days it's tariff clauses. I wish more founders understood where tariffs are allocated. That seems to be a very hot item these days.
Yes. Who really thought about that 10 years ago?
Yeah. It's in the legal world, it's kind of a callback to COVID days because there's a clause in every contract called force majeure, which basically is like, hey, if an earthquake happens and destroys my factory, I don't have to do this contract, right? Well, it turns out like pandemics weren't really listed in the list of things that could happen. So that was a big problem. Well, now the big problem is, tariffs going from 1% to 200% was not really listed either. So, force majeure is a niche one that but it comes up, in instances like these. The really the meat and potatoes though that really especially like buyers and investors care about is indemnity, right? So who's gonna step in for who if you get sued? So in the space industry, there's a lot of requirements that the launch company and the payload provider, have certain indemnity clauses. So that's good to understand, especially unique to the industry. So even a really long time corporate lawyer may come into the space industry and say, why is there like cross waivers for everyone not to sue anyone? Like, what is this? But it's because FAA requires a lot of that stuff, or the CSLA, the Commercial Space Launch Act, requires a lot of that stuff. So indemnity is really, really a big one. And then there's always the insurance requirements that can get very niche about like who's going to have the policy, who's co-insured, and sometimes you'll have clauses that say not only do you need to get an insurance policy, you need to name me on it, and it needs to protect you if I sue you. So it's this weird.
Yeah, so understanding that piece, like, do I need to get insurance now?
Exactly, and especially the indemnity, because like that won't come up until it does, right? So, until a third party gets hurt because of some space debris, who's getting sued, and if you do get sued, who's going to step in? So those are really indemnity, insurance, and these days force majeure are the kind of the three clauses that we pay a lot of attention to these days.
And I would add that yes, and you can't take your eye off of data protection. If you understand what proprietary information really means, I still see founder slide decks that aren't marked. And, call it confidential. I like proprietary information because it's a term that's used in the regs in aerospace defense anyway. But proprietary information is anything you consider as a competitive advantage. It could be finance, it could be employee headcount, it could be key personnel, it could be inventories. But often it's technical data in your drawings, right? And you see so many small suppliers undermark their data, and they send up this giant data pack, and it goes through 3 tiers, all the way up to a prime through a data pack, and it's unmarked. And I'm thinking that's got to be proprietary. It looks competitive for them, right? We will treat it as proprietary, but you got to think about contract term, a non-disclosure agreement, all the ways up that data becomes unprotected. And I see small companies grow at a less rapid rate because they're not protecting their data. And when you protect it right, I think you scale and grow quickly.
Mm-hmm. So flip side being, if you don't protect it, anybody can use it.
Yeah. You're putting it out there, and you
Why
just
wouldn't your
send it
clients
up a
use
chain. Right.
Mm-hmm. Vertically integrate that way. That makes sense. Is there any one thing you would advise a founder to do before raising money?
Basically just, and this from having your own business, but organization is just so key, right? You could have all the compliance and all the right docs in the world, but if you don't have them organized, we have lots of times where employment agreements are literally lost, so just being organized and being savvy in the compliance realm, it just helps you up front when you go to investors, because you can't redo that first impression. And if they think you're a mess, that's going to affect how they view the rest of your company.
So if you're not organized, hire somebody that is to set it all up.
A lot of the work we do, believe it or not, in like venture deals will be like helping people set up data rooms and stuff, like getting things organized the way we know investors like to see it, before we even talk to them, right? Because you don't want that first impression to be that you're a mess.
And I would foot stomp the organization starting with stock certificates. If you're a C Corp, it's unbelievable how many companies lose traceability as to what their shareholders actually own. And that's a really embarrassing day when you're going through the due diligence John's speaking to, or 10 years later and you're trying to sell a company, or have a liquid event, right? So meticulous corporate records, corporate board records starting from day one. It's not in their wheelhouse to do this. They want to build product. But, if you're going to start a company, you've got to listen to these podcasts and hopefully get organized.
Get organized. And I mean, that's not everybody's strong suit as well. Usually we come in a couple of flavors, either, trying to make money or, produce services as well. Is there a early hire that you would say, hey, if nobody on your team has this skill set, hire this? What would it look like, whether it's a contract manager or even just a souped up admin? What do you think is the best hire they can make from that standpoint?
I like the souped up admin. I think, having somebody with super organizational skills that is going to protect your data and understands that, the buck stops with that person, and understands privacy, right? Not letting anybody see what other shareholders own. That's really important. Maybe having a small safe on site would be really important. That's closely held, with some backup so you don't lose those keys. You see that in mergers.
Where'd
Well,
the
we
key
have
go?
this, yeah, we're, or they haven't stored stuff properly in the cloud, and you have inappropriate folder shares, right? So don't think of it as brick and mortar. Think of it as cloud organization. So somebody that's also computer savvy.
So, follow up question is, a lot of us are using offshore virtual assistants.
That's a good one for you, Shawn. I think a lot of ITAR implications maybe there. Go ahead.
Well, there's more than that. There's also fraud. Um, my own wife just got defrauded or frauded by an offshore guru. It was the promise of the world. Yeah. So, and you are giving her a lot of leeway, obviously, just to run her business, and she's been doing great. But um, when you got to look at your analytics to find some of these things. And she had, I don't know, dozens of IP addresses all pointing to Russia. Yeah. So, it was only 5K, but scale that, right? I
What
told
could
her,
it have been, though?
right,
Mhm.
exactly. And I tell her, so take a Lockheed Martin or a prime contractor. You know how many costs that get written off because we look at it as a bad day? Think about hiring the wrong person. You might have paid him 150 grand or 80 grand or whatever the level is. And if it's the wrong person 2 years later, you figure it out. That's not really fraud, but it's a form of fraud in my mind because it's a mistake and a regret the company may have, and it's lost time, right? On any skill set. So it's offshoring is your question, but it can be anywhere in house where you make a bad deal, a bad marketing deal, a bad vendor deal, and you don't manage it well, and you learn, the hard way that's sour grapes. Now you got to start over to some degree, and you don't really have the funds for that, perhaps. Um, Worse, if it is offshoring and you had a export control violation, that could really set you back for a small company to get a consent decree or a penalty. Call it a $2 million penalty or 1.5 million or 1 million. You don't have the coffers for that, right? Your founder's funding wasn't designed for that. This is it insurable? Not typically, but what about a cyber spill? Cyber insurance is really expensive, and if the cyber event happens offshore, you have very little recourse. And the challenge there is that's just money out the door, and it could actually bankrupt a small company. So, why set these things up inappropriately with disorganization? Right? Put some think into it, and really develop your business compliantly and thinking offshore. To your point, thinking cloud. Can you ever get your data back? Read these contracts or get somebody who knows how to help you.
So, spend the money on a souped up admin in
A
your
little bit.
country.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, just quickly. Whenever you do, especially like a venture round or an M&A, but like in your purchase agreements, you'll have reps and warranties, right, from the company, and it'll say, "I promise the following things are true." And usually in there, especially in like a hardware company, you'll have like, "We don't have any ITAR violations, known or unknown. We don't, have any data privacy violations, known or unknown." And what happens is if that comes up later, if maybe they get sued and the whole company ends up shutting down later, that investor might come back and sue the company and say, "I want my money back because you promised here in this document, you didn't have any ITAR violations. Turns out you were sharing all this data with an offshore person, deals off,"
They can
type
bite
thing.
you later. Yeah. All right. In the recruiting world, it's a big trend we're seeing too. Future proofing. If you could design the perfect starter checklist for, let's say, a first time founder, may have been doing some commercial work, wants to get into government, what would that be?
Go ahead, Shawn. I think this is a perfect Dirty Dozen segue here.
Dirty Dozen. Let's hear it, Shawn.
Yeah, well, we're presuming that we're past the business plan formation, right? If you look online, you'll see checklists for formation of a business. First things to do, right? To me, we're in the business practice here, and you're trying to make some money. You're trying to get on contract. You really need some golden contracts. If you want to do business with the U.S. government, you actually have to register. Well, first of all, you can hold yourself out as a supplier. If you're aerospace defense, you have to register with exostar.com. If you register with Exostar, you have to pass a NIST questionnaire, the U.S. government agency that deals with cyber. And you will soon find out what your cyber hygiene is. So it behooves you to actually take this questionnaire ahead of time. You need to answer
Can you
110
take like
questions.
A practice round? Do they have questions somewhere on ChatGPT or something?
Yeah, you can get the questionnaire and do some pre-work, right? Kind of like taking the LSAT for law school that John and I had to do, right? So, but it's important that you understand the avenues. If you want to do business directly with the U.S. government, you have to register with SAM.gov. SAM is an acquisition management tool for the U.S. government. And you got to remember, that's the largest customer in the world, not Apple, not Amazon. It's the U.S. government. And 40 agencies spend like nobody's business, as we all know. But all of them require you to register with SAM.gov. And in doing so, now you've got ownership that's listed there. You've got the size of your company. And if you're truly a small business, that can really be a benefit, whether it's a GSA schedule or other federal schedules or direct
I
sales
had to do
to
that
agencies.
to get my women-owned small business.
Women-owned small business, veteran-owned, right? Disabled-owned. There's a lot of great opportunity for disadvantaged businesses, small and, U.S. owned is the other key, right? So you got to make sure you understand your ownership. And sometimes that's asking somebody, what is their citizenship, right? A fellow founder, and ensuring that, your buddy is not really, Iranian, because if they're an Iranian citizen, they can do business in the U.S. There's nothing against that. But can they own a business that's doing business with the U.S. government? Sometimes, but probably not in the defense context where ITAR controlled information has to be passed through. And then there's this whole CFIUS review and other regs that can come into play. So as a small business, any business trying to do business with the government, go to SAM.gov, get registered. Then you have to understand, if you're a product house, you have to understand your NAICS codes. You'll have a CAGE code, which is, your facility location and kind of identity. And all these things get put on every contract that you're ever awarded. So, that's how you get going. And there's a lot of people like us that can help you do that, but it's usually just walking people through a pretty simple process. And then the real rub is when you get those contracts and how do you ensure compliance?
The rubber hits the road. Exostar, Sam, get a souped up admin, get yourself in position. All right. Before I let you guys go, it's been so much fun. If somebody's listening and thinking, oh, shoot, I didn't do that, or I got a ways to go before I'm raising money here, how do they get in touch with you?
Well, both of our profiles are actually at taftlaw.com.
We can link them in the show notes too.
Yeah, that would be great. Have a link. We're also two of the more active LinkedIn attorneys at Taft. So
I saw you both at Space Symposium, didn't I?
And we go to our conferences too. So, but yeah, there's lots of ways to reach us.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been very educational.
Thanks so much, Kev. Thanks for having us.